Thanks so much for joining us today in this open learning event called Human Rights is Our Business. We're really excited to host this session to mark World Human Rights Day, which is tomorrow, 10 December. My name is Cheryl Reddy, and it's a real pleasure on behalf of Social Enterprise Australia to host this webinar. I'm stepping in today on behalf of Patricia Kaziro, founder of Impact Business School. Patricia sends her apologies. She was unable to facilitate today's conversation due to illness, but I know she's hoping to jump on and watch the session if she can. And we wish you a quick recovery, Patricia. This webinar emerged from work that Patricia and the Impact Business School are leading in collaboration with Usman Iftikhar from Catalysr. They're developing a practical toolkit on human rights in business as part of the Social Enterprise Development Initiative. And we'll share more later in the session about how you can get involved in the development of that educational resource. For now, we're absolutely thrilled to be in this Zoom room marking World Human Rights Day with Hidayat Usyan, CEO of Community Construction, Carly Goldstone, Strategic Engagement and Advocacy Officer at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and Danny Fadul, Campaign Manager at the Human Rights Law Centre. All of these wonderful people are kindly sharing their insights and stories to help build our understanding of human rights obligations in social enterprise. As businesses that commit to prioritising people and planet over profit, social enterprises are really well placed to lead the way in demonstrating respect for human rights as a core value and a core practice of business operations. Before we hear from this lineup of speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and careholders of the unceded lands from which we're all joining today. As a migrant settler to this country, I'm privileged to live on the lands of the Wadi Wadi people of the Dharawal language group, and I pay my respects to elders past and present who've cared for country and community for thousands of years. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining today or viewing this recording later. I recognise and am thankful that your presence holds over 65,000 years of systems thinking and relational care for people, place and planet. And when we talk about human rights, we recognise our responsibility to stand alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the work of self-determination and truth-telling to help grow safe and healing futures for everyone. The format for today is that each of our speakers will share individually some of their key insights on the topic of human rights in business, and then we'll bring them together for a panel discussion, and we hope to have time for questions as well. So let's kick off. For those who are not familiar with Human Rights Day, it commemorates the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This year's global theme is Human Rights as Everyday Essentials, which is a perfect way to start with introducing Hidayat Usyan. Hidayat is the founder of Community Construction, a social enterprise that provides training, employment and career pathways into Australia's construction industry for people from refugee backgrounds. Hidayat arrived in Australia in 2010. He's completed degrees in politics and international relations and arts and design at the University of Canberra, and he established Community Construction in 2017. Hidayat's leadership and impact have been recognised nationally and internationally, including receiving the 2024 Les Murray Award for Refugee Recognition. Hidayat, it's lovely to be in the Zoom room with you today. We'd love to learn a bit more about your experiences in the construction industry and your journey of starting your own social enterprise. Why does human rights in business matter, and what does it look like on the ground as an everyday essential? Over to you.
Thank you, Cheryl, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Cheryl and the Social Enterprise Australia, for giving me this opportunity to speak with two distinguished guests, Carly and Danny, today. Well, I believe human rights matter in business because they protect people, promote fairness, and ensure responsible conduct. But in social enterprise, they matter even more because respecting human rights is central to our mission. If a social enterprise prioritizes people and planet over profit, then respecting human rights must sit at the core of how we operate. In social enterprise, we are protecting the rights of workers. Social enterprise ensure that every person involved in the business is treated with respect and dignity. This includes fair wage and safe working conditions, non-discrimination in hiring, training, and promotion, supporting vulnerable communities such as refugees, women, and people with disability, providing job security and professional growth, and also creating inclusive employment pathway. Social enterprise often hire people with systematic barrier in the labor market, including refugees, migrant, First National people, women, young people, and other marginalized communities. By doing this, they break the cycle of exclusion created by racism and bias, providing meaningful jobs to individuals who have been overlooked or discriminated against. Let me share why I started my social enterprise and how I started. When I finished my university, my honors degree in 2016 in Canberra, I moved to Sydney during Christmas break, and I was working in construction site. It was a very hot summer day like today. I was working in a big construction site in Sydney City. There was a lot of refugee like myself who was working on that site. There was one guy, he was a forklift driver, and he was making a lot of trouble for people who don't speak English or who don't defend themselves. He often work on the fresh tile, which some refugee, they work for the long day. And then by the end of the day, this guy came and worked, and the people who are refugee, they couldn't defend themselves. And it was a lunchtime, a very hot day. This guy came to the lunchroom and he was start to making some fun of people who don't speak English. And then I stand up and I said, "This is not right. I'm not going to let you to do this." And then after that guys left, everyone in the room from refugee background, they said, "You're lucky. You speak English. You have built a network. And why you're working in this tough environment? We have been working in this environment for a long time. Sometimes we have been ripped off. Sometimes we have been exploited. Like we work for a company for 1 month, and after the end of the month, the employer say, we are not going to pay you. And we have no idea how to navigate the system, how to ask for our rights. And also they are scared of the authority. They don't want to go to the court or maybe the fair trading. Oh, they never heard of this. So, and I said, this is not right, and we have to do something. And they asked me, you're one of us. You came in Australia by boat and like us. So can you provide a safe space for us? We really want to work. We want to contribute. We want to support our family. We don't want to be on Centrelink. So is there any way you can provide a safe space for us so we can work? And I did some research and I found that construction is the huge industry in Australia. It's booming. At the same time, there's a loss of labor shortage. Even now, there's around 95,000 labor shortage in the construction industry. And then I thought this is a perfect area, so I can set up a company to train this entrepreneurs to fill this gap. So I started my social enterprise community construction in 2017. In the last 9 years, we employed over 100 people who have been exploited. Some of them, they have been mistreated in the workforce. Now, most of these 100 people, they're working full-time in construction industry. Around 80% of them, they bought their own houses in Sydney. 7 of them, they set up their own company. And also my business has been invited at the international event like the Global Refugee Forum in Geneva 2 years ago to showcase my business as a good practice. So I believe like every individual can make a contribution if you give them equal opportunity and treat them with respect and dignity. Thank you, and back to you, Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Hidayat, for sharing your personal and professional experiences with us, or a tiny glimpse of what you've experienced. It's mind-blowing, and not in a good way, to know that in 2025 such harmful exploitation, abuse continues to happen in Australian workplaces across many industries, not only construction. At the same time, it's equally mind-blowing in a good way to hear how you've created a different way of doing and being, not only for yourself, but for so many other refugee entrants and their families. Really looking forward to delving deeper into this in the panel discussion. Thank you. We're excited now to hear from Carly. Carly is an accomplished international human rights lawyer, bringing over 2 decades of experience advocating for the rights of women, children, refugees, and internally displaced persons. Her work is driven by a passion for equity, inclusion, and the belief that meaningful change is possible when policy, advocacy, and community engagement come together. Carly, many of us in the social enterprise and social economy world, we ground our business, as Hidayat was saying, in values of fairness, equity, creating work opportunities for people experiencing discrimination in the labour market, including people with disability and people from refugee backgrounds, to name a few. Could you give us a sense of the human rights obligations and the framework that applies to business owners in Australia? Like, how do we know what we need to do to comply with human rights standards?
Well, hi everyone, welcome. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I have to say it's been wonderful to get to know you, Cheryl, and to have you involved in Danny and I's Business and Human Rights Act joint advocacy group. I just want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from unceded Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to past, present and emerging leaders, and particularly any person who identifies as First Nations on this call. Frameworks and policy reform, all of this is really important, because no matter who we are or what circumstances we find ourselves in, we all have a right to be treated with respect and dignity by our government, by those who work for it, and by our fellow community members. Human rights gives us a roadmap to create the kind of society we all want to live in, one built on equality, on freedom, respect, dignity, kindness, and looking out for each other. When human rights are respected, our lives are better and our communities are stronger, healthier, safer, and more prosperous. So the current situation here in Australia is really interesting. The reality is that human rights in Australia are not as well protected as you think. Australia has signed up to international human rights treaties, but we have not properly translated those commitments into our national domestic law. Our framework is a patchwork. There are rights scattered across different laws in the Constitution and the common law, and there's different state and federal laws that relate to, for instance, discrimination law. It's incomplete and it's really hard to understand, even for a human rights lawyer like myself. The Constitution protects only a handful of rights, and discrimination law covers some areas, but many key rights have no federal protections. So unlike similar nations like New Zealand, Canada, the UK, we have no National Human Rights Act. We do have state-based Human Rights Act in Queensland, Victoria and the ACT, and they've proven to have really positive impacts. But it's time for the rest of Australia to catch up. The Commission proposed a National Human Rights Act that was adopted by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, which my friend Danny will go into in his presentation. But it's really designed to reflect the values that Australia stands for, which is fairness, dignity and inclusion. It's built on international agreements that protect people's basic rights like freedom of speech and association, access to education, the right to health and housing, and the right to work. But for purpose-driven organisations like yourself, this kind of legislation supports a more inclusive and value-led society where human rights aren't just talked about, but where they're actively protected and promoted. So a National Human Rights Act would require governments and public servants to consider human rights when making decisions, delivering services and developing laws and policies. And to give you a nuanced view, if you are a private business that has a federal contact to deliver services, you will also fall under the purview of the Human Rights Act. This simple step fosters a culture of prevention, thinking about rights before acting, and it builds transparency and accountability. And importantly, there is no extra regulatory burden for businesses. So while the Act primarily applies to government, it really matters for business too. It provides clarity on human rights standards and expectations. It creates a level playing field where both public and private sectors respect rights. It encourages business to engage in human rights due diligence, maintain open dialogue with stakeholders, and adopt international best practices. So this is not just compliance, it's risk mitigation, it's workforce retention, and it's reputation building. So businesses, as you know, already have obligations under laws like the Racial Discrimination Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, Fair Work Act, and the Modern Slavery Act. A National Human Rights Act complements these by embedding rights into government policy and lawmaking. So what areas for businesses like yourself will be impacted by the Human Rights Act? So firstly, modern slavery, which encourages stronger due diligence and transparency in supply chains. So that's what a Human Rights Act will do. And a Human Rights Act will build on the Modern Slavery Act, which already requires large businesses to report on risk. Again, it won't place a further or an extra regulatory burden on business. In terms of disability employment, it promotes inclusive hiring and workplace accessibility. Australia ranks really poorly when it comes to disability in the workplace. Only 53% of people with disability are in the workforce compared to 84% without. In terms of gender equality, it will support the proactive obligations to prevent discrimination, which is a positive duty that came out of the speaking from experience work that was done here at the Commission. Interestingly, despite progress, women only hold 19% of CEO roles and earn 21.7% less on average. And I can tell you that taking the years out that I have taken to have my children, my super is also not as strong as it should be. In terms of environmental protections, it reinforces sustainability and intergenerational equity, and it aligns with commitments under the Climate Change Act and the Paris Agreement. So really, a Human Rights Act will clear pathways for accountability. It will create accessible mechanisms for individuals to challenge laws, policies and practices that are inconsistent with human rights standards, which in turn makes those creating the policy or creating the legislation or administering the service to be more accountable from the outset, which then in turn hopefully prevents some harm being caused in the first place. So it really will strengthen the social foundations that you as a business rely on, and it will create a fairer, more resilient society where everyone can thrive. And in turn, the government's commitment to these standards enhances its credibility and accountability, reinforcing a culture of rights, respecting governance that mirrors the responsibilities already placed on business. So it's not just a legal reform, it's a cultural shift. It's about building an Australia where rights are respected, communities are stronger, and businesses can lead with confidence and integrity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carly. Wow, when you talked about the current situation across Australia, human rights in business is a complex beast, especially for those whose businesses operate in more than one state or territory. If there's different laws in different jurisdictions, that's not an easy task for social enterprises when it's hard enough just keeping the enterprise running day to day.
Yeah, and I would also quickly say that not only does it make it difficult to work out which legislation applies or which legislation will give the best access to remedy or pathway to remedy, but also it doesn't take account the intersectional nature of harm. Often people experience harm in multiple ways because of their gender or sex, because of their race, because of their religion, because of their nationality, and it melds together. And the way in which our law is expressed at the moment really silos it and really prevents people from properly standing up for their rights and having access to remedies.
Thanks, Carly. It's so great for us in the social enterprise space to learn about, the human rights standards and the frameworks that we need to be aware of in order to do our business in line with our values and in line with the law. And it will be interesting to speak next to Danny about the value of having a National Human Rights Act and the importance of advocating for one, because what you've described in terms of the current situation sounds both essential and also complex for the average social enterprise or business owner to navigate. Danny, it's lovely to have you here today. For those who don't know Danny Fadul, he has a wealth of campaigning experience from his time within the union movement and also at GetUp, developing and leading campaigns on economic justice. Danny joined the Human Rights Law Centre in 2020 and is passionate about creating an Australian Human Rights Act. So Danny, I'd love to know a bit more from you about what would it look and feel like to have a National Human Rights Act, for the average business owner.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Cheryl, and great to see you all today. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Gadigal land and pay respects to elders past and present, and sovereignty was never ceded. Also wanted to note that today is an apology being provided by the Victorian government and that's in the lead up to celebration on Victorian Treaty that's taking place this Friday. So if you are based in Melbourne, go along to the treaty celebrations happening at John Cain Arena. You know, human rights benefit everyone, but it benefits in particular marginalised communities, especially the oldest continuous living culture and civilization on this planet, which have not had their human rights respected ever since first contact took place in 1788. And I want to start off by picking up where Carly left off, which is we have these values that we all agree as a society, equality, freedom, dignity, justice. But those values are not at the heart of government decision-making, service provision, or laws for that matter. A whole bunch of things that governments need to be considering. How much does something cost? Did we promise at the last election? What does the community think about it? All relevant things to consider. But human rights are not one of those things that they consider. And that's what those values are about. Human rights is think of it as an expression of those particular values when it comes to specific things that that everyone in our society should be able to enjoy and benefit from. And we're not talking about things which those values not being in our laws and in our services having no consequences. We've had Royal Commissions worth of examples of where that's not the case. The Aged Care Royal Commission, the Disability Royal Commission, the Robo-Debt Royal Commission in the last 4 years. The Disability and Aged Care Royal Commissions both highlighted human rights standards not being at the heart of those particular areas, being a fundamental reason why there were systemic problems that got to the point where a Royal Commission was needed to get to the bottom of it. And both of those Royal Commissions recommended human rights standards as a key way of ensuring that there's not a repetition of the issues that those Royal Commissions faced. And as folks on this audience would know, both of those areas are not just areas which government is engaged in, but a lot of social enterprises are involved in as well. So we're not talking about something which only government needs to be looking at. It's also something which has consequences well beyond that as well. And that's where a Human Rights Act comes in. It provides an expression in law of those human rights standards that not only we've promised the world to uphold, as Carly mentioned in her presentation, but also those standards that our community would expect. Those standards, civil rights like right to privacy, right to equality, the right to dignified treatment, the economic and social rights, housing, health, education, cultural rights, the right to a healthy environment, all of those standards are standards placed into law with the Human Rights Act. And that means that two things happen. One, government must be considering those human rights when they come with a new law, with a new policy, or running a service. It also means people have the ability to take action. There's something they can point to and then take action as a consequence if those rights are not being respected, something which is incredibly difficult to do right now, as Carly mentioned in her presentation. And as Carly mentioned, that we already have 3 jurisdictions at the state and territory level. This already happens. We don't have to consider this as something that's happening overseas to look at, or even something that's theoretical. We can look at it practically, how it operates in Queensland, in New South Wales, and the ACT. And we've compiled 101 examples of how those human rights standards have benefited people in Queensland, Victoria, and the ACT. And I want to share with you 2 stories from that. One is in Queensland, where a domestic violence survivor, she was in social housing. That social housing was provided by a community housing organisation on behalf of the Queensland government. And she was being evicted from that social housing due to the actions of her abusive ex-partner in breaching a lease. By using the Queensland Human Rights Act with the support of Tenants Queensland, she was able to raise with the social housing provider that they hadn't properly considered her rights under the Queensland Human Rights Act in that process. The community housing provider looked at that issue again, realised that they had not properly considered the human rights standards in the Queensland Human Rights Act, and as a result, that eviction got reversed and she was able to stay at home with her family. Another example that we've got in the one-on-one cases is of a child with disability during the COVID-19 pandemic. They just come back from overseas and they were placed into hotel quarantine. Hotel quarantine was something that was mandated by government but was being provided by contract by a non-government entity. And in that hotel quarantine process, that child with disability was not getting the support and services that they needed to help manage their disability. They were clearly going to deteriorate in their well-being and health in that hotel quarantine situation, in that extreme isolation. By using the Queensland Human Rights Act, they raised the issue with the Queensland Human Rights Commission. Queensland Human Rights Commission raised it with the Queensland government and the provider of the hotel quarantine service for the Queensland government. The very next day, that child and their family was taken out of hotel quarantine and placed into isolation at home for the quarantine period so that the child could access the disability support services that they needed. That's the sort of power that human rights standards can provide to benefit people across our community. But the most beneficial way that those Human Rights Act work is better decisions at the very beginning, because you have better decisions by government, better laws at the very beginning, better service provision, which means that you avoid those problems later on down the track. But obviously, nothing will be perfect, and so you need that ability to take action when those rights are being breached. And so it's in that context that the federal government asked the Federal Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights to inquire into whether there should be a National Human Rights Act to replicate what has happened in Queensland since 2019, Victoria since 2006, and the ACT since 2004, because those acts only apply at the state and territory level. They don't apply at the federal government level. And that inquiry took place between March 2023 to May 2024. It ran for 15 months, received 338 submissions, held 6 public hearings in Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, and Brisbane. The vast majority of the submissions supported the Human Rights Act. Ditto the inquiry hearings and the testimony they heard orally from a whole bunch of organisations, individual experts. And the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights recommended, amongst other things, that there should be a National Human Rights Act. It should include all those human rights standards that Carly and myself mentioned, and that there should be an effective way of ensuring those rights are enforced by people if their rights are not being respected. That inquiry recommendation was fantastic. Also, they had an illustrative Human Rights Act at the back of their report, so that's always nice to see how it pans out in detail. And that inquiry report is currently still under consideration by the federal government. So we're still at a point yet where the federal government is considering whether to implement a Human Rights Act at a national level and follow the example of Queensland, Victoria, and ACT in making a Human Rights Act a reality. But I think it's important to note that Human Rights Acts don't happen by themselves. And the fact that we have an inquiry recommendation doesn't guarantee that we're going to have a yes from the federal government or that it'll be implemented by the federal parliament. And so that's why we have the Human Rights Act campaign. We have a campaign of 150 organisations across civil society and thousands of people across the community calling for a Human Rights Act. It involves a whole series of parts of civil society. If a Human Rights Act benefits everyone across our community, so should the coalition of organisations calling for a Human Rights Act. And that coalition includes organisations like Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, the Australian Council of Social Services, Federation of Ethnic Community Councils of Australia, People with Disability Australia. There's a whole gamut of organisations across civil society. You can look at the full list on our website. And so that's why we want to have that campaign coalition. But the more people who are calling for it, the better. The more people who are calling for it, the faster we'll achieve the Human Rights Act and make it a reality so that everyone across our community can benefit. So, and of course, if you are a supporter of the Human Rights Act, that's fantastic. Talking about it with friends, family, and colleagues is important. We've got fact sheets listing how a Human Rights Act benefits people across a number of different ways and a number of different parts of our community. And we also have a report that we released in February on the right to housing. A number of community organisations are involved in the housing space. That report shows how by having a Human Rights Act, we can talk about housing, not about numbers and prices, but about people. And when you have people at the heart of that conversation, you have better conversations at the start and then better policies and decisions that happen at the end of the day and better implementation of those policies and decisions because it's about people, not about numbers and prices. So I might leave it there and I look forward to hearing your questions. But thank you so much for the opportunity to speak and talk about how we can make human rights standards a reality for everyone across our community.
Thanks so much, Danny. It's great to know about the campaign for a National Human Rights Act. We're super grateful for the work that you're doing and really excited to learn more about how we can support it. Yeah, we have 3 questions that came through to us from social enterprises in conversations leading up to this webinar. So the first one is acknowledging that social enterprises already struggle to do a lot with limited funds. So the question that comes up a lot is, does it cost a packet in time and money to make human rights part of business practice? Hidayat, I wonder, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. Thank you for the question. My answer is no. It doesn't have to cost them a packet. With proportional expectation and right support, social enterprise can strengthen their human rights practice without taking any resource away from their core mission. What is important is proportionally, a small social enterprise shouldn't be held to the same process expectation as a large corporation, with particular template and sector support and scalable guidelines. This does not to drain any resource. Respecting human rights does not have to cost any money for social enterprise. In fact, for most social enterprises, it built on practice they already do. For example, for our social enterprise, we treat workers fairly, providing safe environment for them. We are very transparent, avoiding exploitation. It doesn't cost anything for us. So I'm running this social enterprise in the last 9 years. We employed 115 people. We haven't received a single dollar from government. We are a very self-funded organization. We contract the project. We provide a very safe space for refugees to flourish. At the same time, we transform their life and also we make profit. So I believe if we give them the right support, if there's a right structure in the environment, there's no cost involved. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hidayat. Doesn't cost much to be a good human.
Exactly. Yeah.
Danny and Carly, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question?
I would just say that really it mitigates risk and it allows you to hold on to your workforce. And I imagine that that's one of the big challenges, that you have all these great people working for you and you don't necessarily have enough time with them. So the more you create an environment that respects people's fundamental rights, that gives them dignity, that gives them a sense of worth, that gives them purpose, then they will want to work for you. They will turn up with good intentions and they will give their best. And it becomes a cycle of nurturing as opposed to a cycle of punishment or deterrence.
I think that's a really important point, Carly, and especially when we look at the federal government's productivity agenda, we do want to see obviously increased, economic participation, but productivity needs to be productivity with safety and dignity at its core. Danny, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question or that response?
Just to add that prevention is always cheaper than fixing a problem. And just to give you a sense of how much we're talking about, the Disability Royal Commission, that went for years. It cost $500 million to operate. That's just the inquiry. Fixing problems which could have been sorted out at the outset if you had designed buildings better, created a system and process at the outset that thought about the needs of people with disability. If you had done that process at the outset, you wouldn't have needed a huge inquiry with massive expense, also expensive to people like, reliving trauma, going through that process, and then having to go back and fix systems and processes that are in place to better comply with the recommendations of that Royal Commission. Like, that is the sort of thing to think about. The problem you've got, of course, is that when it comes to prevention, it's something which is really easy to quantify at the outset, how much that may cost. It's not so easy to quantify if there's a problem. And the reason why it's not so easy to quantify as a problem is it relies on people speaking up. And I think the critical thing to note is you shouldn't have to wait for people to speak up to raise a problem, because when they are speaking up, chances are that's the first of a lot of people that will be raising that problem, and suddenly a problem which may look like a small problem outset mushrooms very quickly. That is why I think it's important to note that prevention is always better than cure, and having those human rights standards considered at the outset leads to avoiding problems later on down the track. And a good example is when it comes to privacy. If you don't have good privacy policies, standards, and the like that's things you do at the outset to avoid a problem later. You do not want to be the Qantas, the Optus, the Medibank Private that basically had millions of customers' details that suddenly got hacked into the universe because they didn't have up-to-date privacy standards and policies and procedures to ensure that they weren't carrying so much data that wasn't needed anymore. That led to former customers having their details hacked, let alone, of course, their systems not being robust enough to deal with the sort of hacking that goes on these days. So it's that sort of example of fix it at the outset, have that consideration of human rights standards at the outset, leads to better decisions and leads to problems not happening later on down the track.
Yeah, it aligns with what Carly was saying around risk mitigation. What's the risk of not complying with basic human rights as part of your business? Thanks, Danny. Another question that comes up quite often, and we hear it quite regularly, and it's this: my social enterprise or my business, we have a diversity and inclusion policy, we have a diversity and inclusion strategy. Isn't that enough? Um, Carly, I wonder if this is something that you see and hear at the Australian Human Rights Commission as well.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with this a lot, and I have to say it's a great start, but honestly, it's not enough on its own. In Australia, the issue is that diversity inclusion it's not just nice to have, it's not just a business trend, it's a human rights obligation. It's about making sure every person has dignity, they have equality, and the ability to participate fully in the workforce. Our laws, like the Fair Work Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, Racial Discrimination Act, and even the Disability Discrimination Act, already set out that expectation. The problem I see is that D&I programs today focus on optics or business metrics, and then they risk becoming very performative. So rather than tackling systemic disadvantage, creating real equality, because true inclusion really means going beyond policy. It means embedding principles like anti-racism, self-determination, and intersectionality in how you hire, how you promote, and how you design your workplace culture. When you root D&I in a human rights framework, you're not just ticking a box, you're actually building a workplace that's fair, that's lawful, that's genuinely inclusive. And that approach reduces risk, it strengthens trust, and it makes sure every worker, regardless of their background, has a right to a safe and respectful and equitable workplace where they can thrive. But D&I, and I can't stress this enough, is not anti-racism work. While D&I may include anti-racism as one of its components, it does not inherently, it doesn't centre race or the systemic nature of racism unless it's designed to explicitly do that. Anti-racism is inherently political, and it's based on concepts of justice and equity. So it challenges these dominant narratives and calls for the redistribution of power and resources. D&I practice, particularly in a corporate setting or an institutional setting, is often framed in an apolitical or a business case term, which can limit, I guess, the potential for transformation in the business. And that is why we still need an anti-racism strategy. Here at the Australian Human Rights Commission, we have a roadmap for governments, non-government organisations, businesses and civil society organisations to take anti-racism action across the sector. It's called the NAF, the National Anti-Racism Strategy. It still has not been adopted and has broad support. But there are 63 recommendations that are a call to action for across Australia's the systems, the structures, including the justice system, including the legal system, including health, education, workplaces, media, the arts and data, exactly what you were talking about before, Cheryl. And Danny. The Commission intends for the framework to be a living document that grows as communities experience and as racism evolves. So you need both, is the point.
Thanks, Carly. Danny, did you want to add something to that response?
The only thing I wanted to add is that when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the things to remember is that's policy. So policy is something that is pretty straightforward to get rid of if you don't want it anymore, and we're seeing that happening right now in the United States. That is why we're talking about legislation with the Human Rights Act, and then there's policies and the like that flow from that, because you need that foundation. If you have a human rights foundation that is legislated, that is solid, then you can build all the various elements, of which diversity, equity, and inclusion policies is one of many elements that flow from it. But if you have the things that flow from it without the foundation, not only is it more straightforward to get rid of because it's a policy, easy come, easy go, but also you've got the issue of things that are missing, as Carly mentioned, because the Human Rights Act has the whole gamut of human rights standards listed. And that's something that's important to make sure that you have all of those human rights being considered, because when it comes to certain situations, half of those rights might be relevant, or only a quarter, or only one. But by having the full gamut of those rights in the Human Rights Act, it becomes something that's a much more comprehensive process for a better outcome that flows from that.
Thanks, Danny. Hidayat, did you have anything to add to that question around diversity and inclusion?
Yep, sure. I definitely agree with Danny and Kali. The diversity and inclusion policy is really important, but it doesn't cover the full picture. I have been speaking at different events, and then there's a lot of construction company, big company, and they come and ask me, we have a diversity and inclusion policy, so it's great to hear about your study, so we want to work with you as a partner. But when we start our chat I send some of my document, and they expect a lot from us. As a social enterprise, as a very small company, they expect us to have like all the document properly documented and have all the paperwork maybe very professional. And that's not working because social enterprise, as you know, it's a very small and with very limited resource. So we have to get some outsourced professional to provide those documents. So that's why after a while when we chat and then they just silence us. But as a social enterprise, our impact stretch far beyond our staff. We work with lots of vulnerable community, supplier, contractor, participant, and sometimes people in really complex situation. For example, sometimes I book one of my project, and then two of my employees, they don't come up on the work site, and I have to reach out to them and say what's going on. And some of them, they have a lot of complex issue, like very traumatized, and sometimes they have a lot of family issue. So I have to work with them and make sure that it's okay. So we have a lot of flexibility trying to work with that community to make sure that we provide enough support for them to at least, and the next day they can come back to the work. And I think that's very important that we should make sure that our program is safe, and are we unintentionally excluding or harming someone, or are people in our supply chain treated fairly? It's important. Thank you.
Thanks, Hidayat. Yeah, that's so critical to think about unintentional as well as, the harm that you see that's visible. Yeah, thank you. We have 3 questions that have popped up in the chat. The Northern Territory has recently decreased the age of legal responsibility from 12 to 10 after years of hard work to bring it from 10 to 12. Would a Human Rights Act prevent jurisdictions from such moves? Could we get one of you to respond to that?
Okay, firstly, I'd just like to say that this is something that the Commission discusses a lot, particularly through the lens of our First Nations Commissioner, Katie Kiss. It's a terrible reality. It will cause compounded harm after harm after harm. It has generational impacts. Unfortunately, a Human Rights Act will not be able to deal or force state legislation to raise the minimum age to something like 14, which is the recommended age. It doesn't come under the jurisdiction of the federal government. It is under state law. And while a state Human Rights Act might be able, there might be able to have some remedy, some claims against it, unfortunately, there's not a lot of room there because it is such a political issue. It's like asylum seekers. It's been deeply politicised in Victoria, and the media and different groups have stereotyped and villainised certain young people. And then the answer is always, well, let's, minimise the age. Let's create a space where we can hold young people in detention, and where we can, protect the streets. But we're seeing that that's not the reality. All the data around it says that that's actually the opposite occurs. But unfortunately, no, a National Human Rights Act will not help. Danny, continue the conversation.
Yeah, the big thing to note is that a Human Rights Act means you've got greater transparency and accountability regarding decisions being made by government, which may not fully adhere to human rights standards. The Human Rights Act is legislation. It's not some sort of silver bullet that fixes every human rights issue and problem that's out there. It's not designed to do that. Parliamentary sovereignty is still maintained, but what it does do is make sure that there's clear transparency, that there are human rights standards that are not being adhered to if you're going to make that decision to lower the age of criminal responsibility, and then it's up to the community to make a decision. Is that something that you are willing to support or oppose and hold the political leaders accountable for the decisions that they make? Because as Carly mentioned in her presentation, human rights culture is improved when you have a Human Rights Act, because it's no longer a Byzantine, complicated labyrinth of incomplete human rights standards that are here, there, everywhere, that no one can point to or understand how they can enforce. That's the benefit of a Human Rights Act in that sort of situation, but it's not a silver bullet. But let me be clear, nothing is a silver bullet. Human rights standards have to be lived and respected and advocated for by people in the community. And that's what the transparency and accountability of a Human Rights Act can assist the community do if they want to make sure those human rights standards are being upheld.
Thank you. We might move on to the next question. The issues that Hedayat spoke to earlier in construction are two sides of the same coin. Human rights abuses and exploitation are really common in mainstream supply chains. Social enterprises can be a solution, and for many social enterprises, social procurement policies and frameworks, can be a competitive advantage. But in a procurement context, human rights are often considered through a risk lens, for example, through modern slavery legislation, which is treated very separately from social procurement. So Matt's question is, could a National Human Rights Act help to address this?
I can have a go. So thank you so much. That's a really good question. And I think it boils down to this, which is at the end of the day, it's easier to talk about adhering to human rights standards from a risk perspective if you are a social enterprise than the opportunities that come by showing your values, showing that you're living those values in a whole bunch of different ways. And a good example of how that's been operating in the last couple of decades is when it comes to environmental sustainability. 2 decades ago, environmental sustainability was something that was considered to be a burden, a cost. Do I really need to do this? And now it's something which is considered to be an advantage. There are people in the community who are not just interested, but are anxious to support enterprises, products, services that have environmental sustainability at its core. And so that is something which is so much so that we have corporations and institutions being busted for greenwashing, pretending that they're environmentally sustainable, but not actually doing so in reality. So I think that's something that we can see, that in growing social understanding and awareness and is growing in the community. And by having those human rights standards, it's not just about dealing with possible problems before they happen. By having those human rights standards, you also are providing an advantage about a whole bunch of things that you're doing well. You are part of the community. You're a good social citizen. You are upholding all of these various standards, and people increasingly support human rights. It's worth noting that surveying that's been done by Amnesty over the last 3 years shows 3 out of 4 Australians support a Human Rights Act. So human rights standards is something that people across our community support, and by being able to express those values in how you operate and how you deal with customers, other organisations, government and the like, that's something which has tangible benefits, not just in terms of risk mitigation. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Thanks so much, Danny. Appreciate it. We've got one last question, and I'm actually going to link that to a final takeaway question from all of you. There's currently a concern regarding marginalised voices being silenced. How can the movement for a Human Rights Act be fostered outside of those who are already converted to the cause? Especially when we're living in a fragmented society where not everybody believes or understands or cares about supporting and respecting the rights of everyone. And I'm going to link that to a question for each of you. What is one key takeaway or call to action for individuals, social enterprises, peak bodies, businesses that are online today? What's one thing each of us could do to help strengthen respect for human rights in business?
I think that it's the old saying that your parents always told you, treat people the way you want to be treated. It's really that simple. Treat people with dignity and respect, and they will bust their gut for you. They will do the best that they can for you. Like Danny was talking about, we talk about this being a cultural change. It will create spaces where harm will be prevented. It won't just be dealt with once something serious has really, caused a deep violation for someone. The other call to action, I would say, from my point of view, is get in touch with your local federal members and tell them that you would like to see a National Human Rights Act, that you're a social enterprise, that even though you may not work for the federal government, that you see the value in having all our rights in one place, so people actually have an education and an awareness what their rights are, but more importantly, that there are avenues for enforcement, because once there are avenues, clear avenues for enforcement on the same playing field for everyone, it means the person making those policies or that legislative reform or providing that service has to think about that in the very early stages of this process, which then can mitigate risk and it can prevent harm.
Thanks, Carly. Hidayat?
Yeah, I think I just share my own story. When I arrived in Christmas Island Detention Center in 2009, for the first time, I was treated with respect and dignity. Even though it was a detention center, I heard a lot of people, they complaining about how they have been treated. But for myself, as a personal story, because I am from a minority ethnic group in Afghanistan, I was treated like a second-class citizen. But when I got to Australia, for the first time, they treated me with respect and dignity. And that gave me a really good impression of Australian communities. And I decided I have to work hard to be a part of this community, because even though I came illegally in this country without any document, very strange from a very underdeveloped country, and they welcome me with open arms. And now I feel it's my responsibility to embrace this community and contribute. And I think every individual in the Australian families and also in different organizations and social enterprise, they can play a key role if we open our arm, if we respect everyone as a human being. I'm sure those people who come to Australia, they will embrace, they will feel like they all belong to this country. And I think it's, as Kale mentioned, it's a common sense, and we should respect everyone based on humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Hidayat.
Okay, you're going to love this, folks. That Amnesty International poll I mentioned, where 3 out of 4 Australians support a Human Rights Act, also shows that 51% of Australians think we already have one. Yeah. Could it be US cop shows and, I got the right to remain silent and where's my phone call? Or is it a situation people think life's pretty good and there must be human rights standards behind it because we're a Western liberal democracy, so surely we've got those human rights standards. I don't know what the specific reason why, but I think that's one of the reasons why that question is actually relevant. You're not going to fight for something if you think it already exists. So I think the first thing I'd say is talk to friends, family, and colleagues about the fact that we do not have those human rights standards in our laws, but we should, and everyone would benefit if that's the case. The second thing I would say is join a Human Rights Act campaign. You'd be shocked to learn I'd be asking for that because we'll only achieve this by doing it together, because if it benefits everyone across our community, then we need everyone across our community calling for it. And I think the final thing I want to share is this, which is that we all have that right, have that role to play. This isn't going to happen by itself. Past efforts to achieve a Human Rights Act fell over because a whole bunch of misinformation was being peddled as to what a Human Rights Act would do, which is nonsense. But mis and disinformation can run rampant pretty quickly. But lots of people showing the positive benefits of why we need a Human Rights Act, that is a far more durable, stronger way of that message getting out there and resonating in the community and in our decision makers. So making sure we talk about a Human Rights Act and the benefits it provides is a powerful way of making sure we win this at the end of the day. So I look forward to hearing more from you, and I look forward to folks getting involved in the call for a Human Rights Act to get that human rights benefits for everyone.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Carly. Thanks, Hidayat. My call to action is to encourage everyone to contribute to the development of a human rights is our business educational resource that the Impact Business School and Catalysr are creating. The aim of the resource is to help businesses understand their human rights obligations, apply them in daily operations, and build safe and respectful workplaces for everyone. So tell us what you'd like to see in that learning resource. And tell us what you need to see in a learning resource to help you grow rights respecting practices as part of your social enterprise. So there's lots to think about there and lots to action about. Deepest thanks to Hidayat, Carly and Danny for your generosity in sharing your wisdom and your experiences and your expertise with us today. Thank you too for your boundless passion and commitment to human rights as everyday essentials for everyone. Mountains of gratitude also to Patricia Kaziro from Impact Business School and Usman Iftikhar from Catalysr for your evolving work in developing a human rights in business toolkit for social enterprises. It's much needed given the conversations we've had today, and we're looking forward to seeing it come to life next year. Thank you too to the team at the Department of Social Services who are supporting the development of these learning opportunities as part of the federal government's Social Enterprise Development Initiative. And thank you to the Social Enterprise Australia crew behind the scenes who make these open learning sessions happen, especially Cara, Megan and Bree. Wishing everyone a happy and safe holidays for those taking a break in the coming weeks, and we look forward to seeing you in 2026. Thank you.